It is a black day in Hong Kong as violent acts were perpetrated at the Liaison Office of the Central People's Government in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, one of the offices set up by the Central People's Government in the Hong Kong SAR and its constitutional functions. While some protesters had maliciously surrounded and tried to storm the office, some even smeared the Chinese national emblem and painted insulting words on the walls outside of the office. But who is behind the Hong Kong's riots? What should be the top priorities for Hong Kong now? And where will the one country, two systems policy lead to? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Victor Gao Zhikai, Vice President at the Center for China and Globalization, and Anna Tangen, a current affairs commentator. We will also speak to Professor Tom Brooks, Dean and Chair in Law and Government at Durham University via satellite. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. Now, the Hong Kong public says no to the radical protesters. What kind of a deep message did they deliver to those who have been following the development in Hong Kong?
I think the silent majority in Hong Kong spoke, and the message is clear. They still want to have rule of law. They want to maintain stability. They want to maintain a stable business environment so that people in Hong Kong can continue to prosper. They do not want to have violence or riots, for example, or damage to public property, or biting off fingers of a police officer, for example. So I think the choice is very clear. Hong Kong is at a watershed right now, and to protect rule of law and to allow demonstration and protests to proceed in a peaceful manner is the key for the future of Hong Kong.
Anna, are you hopeful that Hong Kong will have a future? Because the vandals have damaged so much of the reputation of Hong Kong, whose prosperity and stability is something that the Chinese mainland takes so seriously. What do you think of, for example, the consequences arising from the recent turmoils in this territory?
I'm somewhat pessimistic, because what you have here is a situation where the trust has been broken, much like in the dealings between the U.S. and China. You have outside influences who are cheering on, if not directly supporting, these types of violent activities. I mean, they raided a warehouse and they found 4 pounds of explosive, all sorts of incendiary devices, the makings of Molotov cocktails, hats, poles, all of the things that could lead to a very violent. You've already had a beginning of violence, and it's only starting to escalate. And it shows that a small group of dedicated anarchists, or whatever they, successionists, are trying to make the agenda there. The irony is that many of the groups and people who are supposedly cheering this on, the professionals, the expats in Hong Kong, they will be the first to leave, because they're concerned about security. They're concerned about what will happen if Hong Kong continues in this direction. So the irony is that these young people, these people who've been radicalized, and who will not be able to leave, will be stuck in a country that has lost a lot of its economic an area that has lost its economic impetus and will not have a great future.
Let me go over to Professor Tom Brooks, who's standing by in the UK. Hello, Professor Brooks. Do you share the same concern that one day perhaps Hong Kong will be turned into Northern Ireland, something that had worried London for years and years, but fortunately you've had the peace process, you've had the peaceful settlement of the issues, but do you share the same worries that Hong Kong will plunge into anarchical chaos and would perhaps one day become what was called the Northern Ireland issue in your history?
I agree with what's been said so far. I wouldn't go as far as saying I worry about it becoming anything like Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was a very different situation that had issues of violence and extreme violence for a very long time. And only with the things like the Good Friday Agreement relatively recently putting an end to it, although right now we see some efforts by some in British politics now to maybe try to change that. But I think in Hong Kong we have a worrying situation right now, certainly. Protests are nothing new. Protests like this are, but it is very recent. And I think, and yes, it'll be worrying seeing these types of incendiary devices and so on that have been found. I think that is very troubling, but also very small compared to the kinds of weapons that have been found in Northern Ireland and the kind of violence that's been happening in Northern Ireland for a relatively long time compared to Hong Kong. So I think there's something to be worried about, but it's nowhere near the concern of Northern Ireland, at least not now.
But we have seen many apparent signs indicating that Taiwan stands ready to get involved. The CIA will not be left free, will not walk away from this. Look at the remarks. The former CIA director, Mr. Pompeo, about Hong Kong. Well, that said, let's put this aside for a while. Look at the recent response from the British government. Despite the return of Hong Kong to the Chinese mainland back in 1997, the British government and your business community still have a lot of stakes in Hong Kong. Does it mean what Mr. Hunter, Foreign Secretary, said could be justified in response to the development in Hong Kong?
Well, I disagree with what Jeremy Hunt was saying. I think that he's been behind the polls to be the leader of the Conservative Party, the next Prime Minister, and I think some of his remarks were not so much aimed at Hong Kong, but I think were very flippantly directed towards winning support in the UK, which I thought was a very irresponsible thing to do, not least because his words did not seem to carry full weight of the cabinet. We heard no one else from the government echo his words or give him support. I think so. I disagree very strongly with some of the things that he was saying, as it were, giving some support to the protesters. I think that for the British government, while it might be understandable that there would be an interest amongst at least the Conservatives, because the Conservatives were last in power with the handover of Hong Kong, the Conservatives might have a particular interest to see Hong Kong thrive and will have a special interest in its situation. I think it's not for the formal colonial power to be telling a city that was not, a democracy under its rule, how it should be running its own affairs. I think it's very much more of a China issue, and I think that the British government could have handled it and should have handled it very differently. And I regret that Hunt said what he said.
Yes, indeed, the British government and the Parliament do have a lot of issues of their own to manage before the Brexit that's going to take place by the end of October. Victor, for days we have been following the rioting and angry protests in Hong Kong. We've got a strong feeling that the law enforcers in the territory have been viewed as to put it in a polite way, very self-restrained, but in a not very polite way, they've been viewed as pretty weak in executing and restoring law and order. What does that mean for the Chinese mainland? We've got the basic law, but does it mean we would endlessly and forever exercise self-restraint and remain pretty silent in front of the rioting that, as we have discussed earlier, vandalized and insulted the presence of the mainland?
Well, several points. First of all, in Hong Kong as a democracy, people do have the rights to protest and demonstrate, but they need to do that within what the law would allow. Secondly, law enforcement people and officers in Hong Kong are probably one of the best trained police forces in the world. Many of them were trained by the British before 1997, and they are very transparent, they are very efficient, they are well liked before. Now, for example, the protesters or rioters are actually targeting the police officers.
And they're taking advantage of the self-restraints of the law enforcement personnel.
Exactly. So this is wrong, and I think we need to condemn the violence, especially violence committed against the police officers.
We're not talking about the rhetoric of the HKSAR government. We're talking about what kind of acts that should have been taken by the police officers. I mean, their fingers were severed brutally.
Absolutely.
And yet,
Therefore,
nothing serious has been taken.
Therefore, I think the Hong Kong police force and the SAR government need to be relentless in defending rule of law. They cannot be ambivalent.
And
I think you're letting your buttons be pushed. The fact is that the world is looking, and even in the papers now, they say they're shocked by the fact that there's this kind of violence being introduced into what they have previously been pushing as a peaceful rise of democracy. This is an ugly face. This is like
let's look at the picture in Hong Kong this way. What would have a New York policeman done in a similar situation when their fingers...
New York policemen are not as highly regarded as Hong Kong policemen. I think the show of restraint in allowing the ugly face of these separatist, small group of separatists to be exposed has actually been of great PR value to China. Seeing these people, if you had ruthless actions by the Hong Kong police, all you would see in the international press is a barrage of police brutality. All of these young protesters would then become martyrs in the eyes of the world. So this is not the course that you want to do. I agree with you, and it has to be tremendously frustrating for those who've been maimed, hit in the head with bricks, fingers bitten off, this type of thing. But they're policemen. They know that their duty. They are Hong Kong citizens. These are not policemen from the mainland. They are trying to do their best for their city.
Victor, many Chinese and foreign alike who observe the development and escalation of the tensions in Hong Kong have been saddened, heartbroken, and they pointed out that Hong Kong may not return to what it was, given the serious division between the general public there. So what would happen next?
Well, first of all, we are all saddened. I'm personally saddened. I'm a permanent resident of Hong Kong. So many friends and colleagues still live and work in Hong Kong. Now, secondly, I think I'm more optimistic about the future of Hong Kong. Why? Because Hong Kong is a highly, densely populated place. That's number one. Number two, for central government in Beijing, they only care about stability in Hong Kong. They want to be very strict in abiding by the one country, two system principle. And the basic law is very clearly written. It's for everyone in the world to see.
That's a beautiful given, rule of law, and we trust the quality of the civil servants in qualifications of civil servants in the SAR government. But you were a translator of our late senior leader Deng Xiaoping. Could you do me a favor and translate this into English? 树欲静而风不止. Given the overseas interference, given the interference from Taiwan and other overseas forces, it means your version, your English version for 树欲静而风不止. I mean, can you do me a favor?
Now, I think basically what that set phrase means is that even if a tree wants to be quiet, the wind still wants to shake it up. Something like this. So,
well put.
Even if, for example, there are people in Hong Kong or within the SAR government who want to really bring calm and stability back to Hong Kong, there are other forces beyond Hong Kong, for example. And it's very clear, you mentioned that, the Taiwan government seems to have a vested interest, for example, attracting these
Taiwan will stand a better chance of winning the re-election.
Yeah.
She would be very happy to see the decline in the situation of Hong Kong.
But I think eventually it will be up to the people in Hong Kong to really think over of the situation and come up with effective ways to deal with the crisis, because it will be in no one's interest in Hong Kong if stability is lost, its rule of law is damaged or destroyed, for example. It would degenerate into an anarchy.
But the fact is that that ship has sailed. I mean, you have an emboldened group that is running the agenda right now in Hong Kong, and they're being emboldened by whom? They're being emboldened by the U.S., Pompeo, giving support to them verbally, and who knows how else. The fact is that right now China and the U.S. are engaged in an all-out trade war that has taken on ugly turns at everything. So you have U.S. ships sailing through the Taiwan Straits, open provocation. You have arms sales to Taiwan. You have the mention of Xinjiang constantly by members of Congress. Congress is meeting with pro-democracy. Mr. Lee, who was a Hong Kong activist and founder of the pro-democracy movement. So they're emboldening these people. But the question is, are they doing more? I mean, is it so far-fetched to believe that the NSA, the CIA, are giving material support to these young outlaws, however you want to term them, and actually trying to run the agenda, trying to put more pressure on China to light a fire not only in Taiwan, but in Hong Kong and everywhere else that they can?
Let me go back to Professor Brooks. Do you believe stability and prosperity of Hong Kong would serve the fundamental interests of the British government and, of course, its business community? Do you want to see interference by overseas forces with the internal affairs of Hong Kong? I mean, of course you disagree, but tell us more about your thoughts.
Oh, I certainly wouldn't support any further interference from foreign governments, you know, as a general principle for anywhere, but particularly not with Hong Kong. I think that it would be, I mean, looking at it from the British perspective, I think that the stability and security of Hong Kong's very important, if for no other reason, for economic interests. There's enormous economic interests that Britain has in Hong Kong's prosperity. The two have a connection. A lot of the big city law firms and banks that I engage with on behalf of my law school have offices in Hong Kong, as well as Shanghai and Beijing and elsewhere. But particularly in Hong Kong, a lot of my former students will return to Hong Kong. There's a lot of activity between the two. And I think if there was some greater instability or economic problems in Hong Kong, in the medium to long term, not just in the short term, I think that would be that would be probably one of the more concerning things to the British government right now. Remember that right now Britain is trying somehow, some way. I don't know how they will do it, but they're trying to deliver on this Brexit promise. I think they'll be very unlikely to pull it off this year, but that's the promise of both candidates, one of whom will be Prime Minister tomorrow. And part of that Brexit promise is that there will be these wonderful new trade deals elsewhere beyond the European Union that'll be bigger and better than anything we've been able to get within the European Union. So they're desperate to find new markets. And the last thing the British government wants is areas where there are strong relations between Britain and China, where there is good trade, in particular between the city Shanghai Index, also the city in Hong Kong. They will not want to see anything be damaged, because it will just make what's forecast to be a real economic problem for Britain an even bigger problem for Britain. So Hong Kong's stability and economic security is particularly of deep interest to Britain, if nothing else is.
Thank you very much, Professor Brooks. The unpredictability and turbulence in Hong Kong may have turned Singapore into one of the territories that benefit a lot from the outbound flight of capital. That said, early July, media reports saying U.S. Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had meetings with Hong Kong businessman Jimmy Lai discussing development related to amendments to Hong Kong's Fugitive Offenders Ordinance and the status of Hong Kong's autonomy under the One Country, Two Systems framework. Also, Victor and Anna, U.S. Consul General to Hong Kong and Macau Curve-Tong said the One Country, Two Systems policy in Hong Kong Special Administrative Region has been a success and continues to benefit both sides recently. What did he mean?
Well, I think there may be ulterior motives by certain departments or certain politicians in Washington involving Hong Kong, but I would say, generally speaking, what the United States can benefit from continued turmoil or instability in Hong Kong. I think American business interests will suffer, for example. There are more than 1,000 U.S. diplomats stationed in their big consulate general in Hong Kong. They probably will be extremely busy, but they will be agonized if greater turmoil, even anarchy break out in Hong Kong. I would say it will be in the interest of the United States and United Kingdom and all the other countries in the world if, for example, Hong Kong maintains stability. Now, you talked about one country, two system. This is exactly the time to defend one country, two system. Why? Because these riotings, these storming of the LegCo, and today or yesterday, for example, the storming of the central government's office in Hong Kong, the smearing of the emblem, for example, and as reported today, even there were rioters who want to storm the PLA barracks in Hong Kong. These are unheard of riots.
Are they playing fire?
They are playing fire, and I hope the Hong Kong SAR government and the central government will be more resolute in
What do you mean by resolute? You want them to have shootings?
No, because
have these young kids beaten?
Excuse me, Victor, what does the basic law say about the response from PLA barracks in Hong Kong?
First of all, there is one provision in the basic law which more or less says that if the Hong Kong SAR government makes a decision that situation will be lost in Hong Kong, they can call on the central government for help. And it is at that time that the central government can do several things. One is to make a resolution by the National People's Congress Standing Committee to say that either some or all of the PRC laws will be applicable to Hong Kong. That's number one. Number two is that they can use the PLA stationed in the Hong Kong barracks to defend the sovereignty and to prevent chaos from breaking out, from deteriorating into anarchy, so that people can still live in peace and stability. I think this is exactly what the one country, two system means. Nothing in the one country, two system principle will allow anarchy to prevail in Hong Kong, will allow, for example, the situation being degenerated into people taking law into their own hands, for example. That's why, allow me one point. The rioting now is not only a violation of the Hong Kong law, it is a violation of the basic law. It's a violation of the one country, two system principle.
Anna, what he says actually suggests, what Victor says actually suggests that all options are on the table for the PLA, for the central government in the Chinese mainland. So what does that mean in the worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario is that they follow Victor's advice and then you'll have havoc on your hands, because the international community will immediately say that China is an authoritarian country. They'll be showing pictures of any student who got shot or bloodied. This will, in effect, do exactly what the U.S. all pressure tactics want, and that is to paint China as the villain. Already in the international press, people are willing to believe that. The only thing that's been holding back is the fact that these young miscreants are seen as violent, as the perpetrators. China is showing restraint. I mean, to say that you'll pass a resolution that mainland laws will apply to Hong Kong would put everything in chaos. There is a completely different system there. It would be very difficult to reconcile that through one act. There have to be a lot of planning. So at this point, restraint is better, but make sure that the public is protected.
Restraints and principles about the stability in Hong Kong are, of course, still there. But as the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing said clearly, in response to the latest situation in Hong Kong, Professor Brooks, that those radical protesters have crossed the bottom line. And this is a very stern warning to those who show their defiance to the warning of the central government in Beijing. Professor Brooks, what are your thoughts on the possibility that once red line is crossed, what will be done by the Chinese mainland? Do you think the SAR government is utterly reliable? And what do you think of the future?
Oh my, these are big questions. I think clearly there are those who have been protesting. I think it's essential that if there are rights to express their views in Hong Kong in a peaceful way in accordance with the laws, as our other discussants have commented, I think it's critically important that if there is anything further that they stick with that, because otherwise these violent aspects of the protest will come to not only be on our television screens, will come to define what this is and really bring it all not just into this one particular instance into disrepute, but could cause further damage to future folks being able to exercise these same rights, because there'll be perhaps renewed concerns about security, how this got out of hand, and how some freedoms might have to be curtailed in future to better handle this. So I think that if, it might even be worthwhile for those who are leading the protest right now to say, look, our intentions are peaceful. These folks who've been violent do not at all represent us, are not part of our movement. We reject them. And to make some symbolic gesture, do something to disassociate themselves, either to call things off, or call things off for the time being, or hold things in some radically different way. Continuing on, it doesn't seem to be an option. That said, there are a lot of forces at work here, and I think that if there were to be more violent scenes, if there were to be more damage happening, not just to property in Hong Kong, but also to reputation, I think
that's indeed a big reputational problem.
The central government will come under enormous pressure to do something.
Thank you so much, Professor Brooks, for being with us.
I think it is more a reputational problem than a legal one.
Thank you so much. Victor,
pleasure.
Despite the violence that has been conducted, that should be condemned or whatever, and should not be forgiven. Those perpetrators must be brought to justice. But there must be a reason behind the anger of the young people in Hong Kong, right?
Allow me to make one point. Whatever anger you may have, you have no right to violate law. You have no right to violate rule of law. And you have no right to bite off the finger of a police officer. That's the bottom line. So whoever in Hong Kong, whatever political affiliation, whatever grievances you may have, air them in a democratic and legal way. Don't violate the law. That's the bottom line. Because otherwise, we will see more anarchy happening in Hong Kong, and then the central government will be forced to react.
Exactly. That's my next question, and very much so. What do you think of the structural problems concerning governance as well as underperformance of the Hong Kong, the market in terms of employment and education for the young people there?
Well, this is the irony. I mean, these kids have been victimized twice. Once in the fact that they can't afford homes. They don't have good jobs that they can afford to do anything. They see no future. There's no hope for them. So they have turned around and blamed the mainland, when in fact what it is Hong Kong has made tons of money over the last 30 years, but it hasn't been distributed. Those at the top have taken all, and those at the bottom in the middle have gotten nothing. So at this point, there needs to be radical reforms. And what I mean by that is maybe adopting a Singapore model, guaranteeing these people, taking land from those who have kept it off the market and giving to those who need it.
Yes, indeed. The future of Hong Kong perhaps lies in the possibility that all young people in Hong Kong would have a future. They would have opportunities. They would enjoy equal access to housing, as well as the job market. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on the Future of Hong Kong. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.